pipe intended for the Keystone XL pipeline at a storage yard near Cushing, Okla. Larry W. SmithEuropean Pressphoto Agency LINCOLN, Nebraska. State regulators were expected to decide on Monday whether to grant the final major permit needed for construction to begin on the Keystone XL oil pipeline, a project that became a politically potent symbol both of Republican dreams for energy expansion and of opponents' fears of climate change and environmental degradation. Nebraska officials said a decision would be announced at the State Public Service Commission's meeting Monday morning in Lincoln, the capital. The project has the strong support of President Trump and many labor unions, but has been opposed for years by a vocal group of Nebraska landowners. Keystone XL's opponents have vowed to appeal if a permit is granted. The pipeline company said that it hoped to begin construction next year. Monday's decision was to come just 4 days after another pipeline operated by the same company spilled 210,000 gallons of oil in neighboring South Dakota, blackening a swath of rural grassland. Opponents of Keystone XL said that episode underscored the risks of crude oil pipelines. But under Nebraska law, the State Public Service Commission is not allowed to consider pipeline safety and spill risks when deciding on a permit. Nebraska emerged more than 7 years ago as an unlikely center of opposition to Keystone XL, which would run more than 1,100 miles from Alberta, Canada, to southern Nebraska and connect there with existing pipelines. Permits and land use easements have long been in place along the pipeline's route through Canada, Montana and South Dakota, leaving Nebraska as the last major obstacle to construction. Supporters of Keystone XL, including many labor unions and business groups, have called the pipeline an economic necessity that would bring more North American oil to market, create jobs and provide a safer alternative to transporting oil by rail or truck. But the opponents in Nebraska, a bipartisan coalition of landowners, Native Americans and environmentalists, stalled the pipeline during Barack Obama's presidency by forcing a route change and then tying up the project in court. They questioned the project's economic merits and said it posed a grave threat to their state's groundwater and farmland. Obama eventually denied a border crossing permit in 2015, citing climate change, but Mr. Trump reversed that decision this year. Mr. Trump was quoted at the time saying that he believed Nebraska will be good, and that he would call Gov. Pete Ricketts, a fellow Republican who supports the pipeline. But the permitting decision fell not to Mr. Ricketts but to the Nebraska Public Service Commission, an elected panel of 4 Republicans and 1 Democrat that functions in relative obscurity and regulates the state's pipelines, electric lines and telecommunications. That commission considered arguments at a multi-day hearing in Lincoln in August that was preceded by a large anti-pipeline protest outside the Nebraska Capitol. The pipeline company, TransCanada, said in its written arguments that the project was safe and a potential economic boon for Nebraska, noting that about 90% of landowners along the route had already signed easements allowing for construction. Company officials said that, if Keystone XL truly impacted the future use of land, it would be expected that a far greater number than 10% of landowners would not have agreed to easements. But lawyers for a group of about 90 holdout landowners pleaded against the permit and predicted that the pipeline with its sludge inside could eventually be abandoned and waste in Nebraska's soil. Until landowners left with a mess are required to remove it, the rental value of nearby Nebraska real estate will be depressed by the pipeline's presence, lawyers for the landowners wrote. It causes long-term operating efficiency losses for farm and ranch operators. The land will be permanently impaired. Some have questioned whether there would still be enough interest among oil shippers to support the pipeline, but TransCanada reiterated its support of the project in early November. We anticipate commercial support for the project to be substantially similar to that which existed when we first applied for a Keystone XL pipeline permit, a company statement said. The political landscape, however, has changed dramatically. Last year, thousands of protesters, mostly Native Americans, gathered near the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation to protest the Dakota Access Oil Pipeline's path through North Dakota, at times clashing with law enforcement. Since then, smaller demonstrations have targeted pipeline projects in Minnesota, Wisconsin and Texas. And if construction ever begins on Keystone XL, activists say, so will more protests.